Hello, it's Adrian Gonzalez, President of Adelante, and welcome to today's MindPick session, which is an opportunity for Adelante members to pick the minds of leading academics, business leaders, folks that are recognized as thought leaders, both in the world of supply chain and leadership development. And today we are privileged to have Kate Vitasek. Kate's a good friend of mine. We've known each other for a number of years. She is a faculty member at the University of Tennessee's Center for Executive Education. She is also the founder and managing partner at Supply Chain Visions, which is a consulting practice that specializes in supply chain strategy and education. And she is the author of two really must-read books. The first one being Vested Outsourcing, which here's my proud copy, which I've read several times and keep referencing it. And the more recently released Vested Outsourcing Manual, a guide for creating successful business and outsourcing agreements. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And for those of you that are members that are joining us live today, just want to remind you that as we get through the conversation here, you can post questions via the lower left-hand portion via the chat sessions, and I'll check that periodically to see if there's any questions from you that I'll then ask Kate. Kate, rather than talk about what is vested outsourcing and getting into the nuts and bolts of that, I think a lot of our members probably have already read your book or some of the work that you've done in this area. If they haven't, they can certainly I'll provide them with a link to your blog and your website that has really a ton of background information about vested outsourcing. Really, what I wanted to do today was really talk about your experience to date, if you will, after the book has been published. Now it's been almost 2 years, I think, since the book came out. You've given, you've taught the course at the University of Tennessee, several times already. A number of different executives have gone through that course, myself included, which I highly recommend. You obviously give a lot of presentations on the topic. You worked with a lot of different companies that are looking to get into vested outsourcing. So really to kick things off, my first question is, what has changed, over the past 2 years in terms of companies understanding what vested outsourcing is and actually putting some of the principles into practice? What have been some of the key things that have occurred over the past 2 years?
Well, it's a great question because, we've been really doing research in this for the last 7 years. And the book came out 2 years ago. And I remember doing a session on the topic at a CSCMP conference probably 4 years ago. So the first book came out February 2010, so almost not quite 2 years ago. But 4 years ago, we were beginning to share some of our work at CSCMP at one of our conferences. I remember someone came up and said, "You are way ahead of your time." And so I think the times are coming, are coming up to meet, where the world is getting ready for vested outsourcing and the vested philosophy. The economy, in one way, was a bad thing, in one way was a good thing. So the economy gave buyers the permission to go out and really consolidate their buys, use their muscle. As Oliver Williamson would say, there's muscular, benign, and credible styles. And so a lot of them that had power used their muscle, and because they could. It was a bad economy, they could go beat up their suppliers. And right. No one wanted to hear about, long-term, sustainable, vested, create value. They were all in, the hunker down, cost. The more muscle I have, the more I can, beat up my suppliers. Well, now, I saw a statistic actually in Harvard Business Review about the number of suppliers that have gone bankrupt or out of business. The market, we don't have some of those suppliers. The fluff in the industry is gone as far as capacity. Another thing is suppliers don't have margin. There's just not leftover margin they can go and take out. It's just there's not, they're already being very lean. And so the only way that buyers and suppliers are going to really create that next wave of opportunity and create competitive advantage is to work together to drive out cost drivers instead of driving out margin into the supply base. So I think the market is ready, where 2 years ago at the height of the bad economy, no one wanted to listen about vested. Even though
Right.
you were out there as an analyst really talking about it, the market wasn't ready, and I think the market's ready. I saw about 10 different trend reports for 2012. Vested outsourcing, long-term relationships were in, I think, 8 of the 10, and vested was called out in 6. 6 of the 10.
Yeah, no, I remember when. No, that's great. I remember when, we started kind of working together and kind of preaching, vested outsourcing out there. I remember saying, this is really, we're kind of in the early education phase in terms of really getting companies to think differently, and I think it's finally, to your point, I think it's finally beginning to gain some traction in some areas in terms of people really starting to embrace it. On that note, though, one of the things when I talk to people about vested outsourcing, one of the most common comments I get, I haven't even finished, my elevator pitch about it. They say, "Oh, well, that sounds like performance-based outsourcing or gain sharing." And you know what? We tried that, and we had limited success with it, or it was a complete failure, and it just didn't work. So a lot of folks, kind of when they first hear about vested outsourcing, they say, "Well, that's performance gain. That's performance-based outsourcing. That's gain sharing," and it really isn't. Can you really kind of explain kind of what the difference is? Because there are some areas of overlap, but there are some differences as well between vested outsourcing and performance-based outsourcing or engagements that kind of also incorporate gain sharing.
Yeah, we actually wrote a really good white paper with the Sourcing Interest Group, the International Association of Contract Commercial Management, and the Center for Outsourced Research Excellence on exactly that topic. And so what we do is we talk about 6 sourcing business models. So if you think about it, on the easiest side, a buy-sell relationship, I need a business model. I'm just going to offer a PO. I'm going to give you a PO, buy-sell. Don't care if you're around next week. I've got an unlimited supply. I have no attachment to you at all, right? And on the far end of the spectrum, so POs are over here, right? And I've got, on the other hand, I'm going to buy. It's so important, or I'm going to make. It's so important to me that I'm going to invest in my own assets, right? So I've got the make-buy decision. Well, in the middle there's a playground, right? I like to think of that we're not playing on the full playground. We have a make or a buy. And if we've decided to buy, the most
Right.
amount of the playground that we're using is we've kind of moved up and said, well, we have a preferred supplier, right? You're a preferred supplier. You're important. But yet, underneath that, the guts of how we work is still transaction-based, right? And so if I think about 6 sourcing business models, vested outsourcing is one of those. Performance-based outsourcing is one of those. Those are 2 of the 6, right? And the big difference between performance-based and vested is one would be how you treat your suppliers. So think of a performance-based outsourcing deal as a green scorecard. You're buying a green scorecard. If they don't deliver a green scorecard, you probably have a penalty associated with that. You may or may not have a long-term relationship, right? You still are probably using competitive bid situations. So you haven't taken the step to a vested relationship is almost like a make decision. It's so important that it's critical to your business. You wouldn't want to competitively bid these guys out all the time, right? It's not in your best interest. You want them to invest, to have a vested interest. A performance-based relationship, green scorecard. You're buying a green scorecard. Performance-based, there's risk and reward around the SLAs, but not around growing the business, creating market share, creating demand, reducing cost drivers. In a performance-based deal, you may have a gain share component. So I've got, I give you a little bonus if you reduce my cost, right? But it's not a vested relationship. A vested relationship, very strategic, long-term, create value, sharing. There's a high degree of sharing. And that's where I think gain sharing went bad. Buyers don't like to share. They like the idea of a 50-50 split on cost. But when it came time to write the checks kind of got big, and they didn't like to write the check. They didn't budget for the check. They didn't like to write the check. And so they cheat. I hate to say that, but buyers are cheaters sometimes. It's like, oh, That wasn't your idea. That was my idea. And so in a vested relationship, it's actually contractually obligated how you would share. And they simulate. We don't have prices. We have a pricing model. And we simulate, wow, what's a home run and what's your share? So we can project out what a home run is and how much that's going to cost me in advance. What if I don't do so well? What's that going to be? So we're very cognizantly aware of the value of what the shares will be and how we're going to share that value.
Yeah, great points. And I did read that white paper you talked about, and I know that's I think available on your website. So we'll make that paper available, or point it in the direction of that white paper, so our members can read that and kind of get a kind of more insights on what you just talked about. I'm going to jump off of my questions now. I noticed that one of our members submitted a question, so I'm just going to go right ahead and ask it. The question is, have you observed any successful or mistakes in transference of quote-unquote vested outsourcing principles into more direct supplier relationships, particularly oligopolistic suppliers, such as railroads, chemical suppliers, etc.?
So I'm going to move my screen over here just so I can see this question a little bit better here. Into direct supplier relationships. No, I haven't seen it in railroads or chemical suppliers, but what I have seen, for example, is McDonald's is probably a wonderful example of a direct supplier. So of a direct with direct suppliers. It's not outsourcing. It's not service. It is beef, right? It is chicken. It is their core direct spend. And they've used the vested philosophies for over 50 years. Actually, Ray Kroc founded McDonald's on the premise of what they call the system. And in the system, it's a three-legged stool. They have the suppliers, the direct suppliers, the McDonald's Corporation, and the franchisees. And they premise is that if they weaken the suppliers, you will actually weaken the three-legged stool, and the whole system will be weaker. So suppliers have a seat at the table, in essence, this three-legged stool. And they use the vested philosophies for direct supplies. And if you look at their spend, their procurement spend, because of the volumes that they put through, the majority of their procurement spend are direct supplies. And they've had a wonderful example. Again, they're the longest running example that we have. They have some of their vested relationships are over 50 years. And they are so vested, they don't even have contracts with their suppliers. The intention is you are a McDonald's supplier unless you screw up, right? And so as long as we're creating value, you're in the system. If you no longer create value, you'll be exited from the system. So they don't bid it out. They have an exit process where if suppliers no longer create value for the system, they are exited. It takes about 2 years to exit a supplier.
That question kind of relates to kind of another question that I had, and which is really when a lot of, and I think you and I were talking about this a year or two ago, particularly shortly after the book came out, where you were getting a lot of inquiries from folks that were looking to apply these principles, not so much in a quote-unquote outsource relationship, because I think when most people hear vested outsourcing, when they hear the word outsourcing, they think of, handing over a business process over to a third party, whether it's logistics or manufacturing, to manage that on their behalf. Where a lot of companies are really thinking about, well, can we use this for more, supplier relationships where we're procuring a product or a raw material or a component? And I think that question kind of tied into that. Are there any differences or special considerations with vested outsourcing, applying that in a product or material-centric type of relationship versus a service-oriented relationship?
You know what? It's exactly the same. So we profiled McDonald's, who are product-oriented, right? And Microsoft and Accenture, who are very service-oriented, back office, procure to pay. And what you see are the rules of the rules. How they manifest themselves might be different. So, for example, in rule number 2 is focus on the what, not the how. Microsoft's statement of work with Accenture is 14 pages. It's a simple T-chart, and it has responsibilities. So instead of having all these tasks outlined and telling them exactly how to, manage an accounting transaction, they said, Accenture, we're hiring you because you are the experts in the field. And so we need to make sure end to end that we're not duplicating effort, that you have a clear understanding of your responsibility. So they have a T-chart that lists out what they call a taxonomy meaning a classification of activities. So they have a classification of activities in a T-chart, and it says, is this Accenture, is this Microsoft? And what they've said is we don't duplicate work because that's non-value added, right? And so if Accenture has the work, then they go and write their own statement of work, right? They write it and say, hey, Microsoft, here's how I'm going to manage these activities. You've now, put into my, put into my control. Are you comfortable with how I'm going to execute your processes? So very different. McDonald's, for example, would manifest rule number 2 with regards to their quality standards, right? So they don't tell their suppliers, their beef or chicken supplier, how to actually run their plant, right? It's none of their business, they'll tell you, but they do care about the output of the plant, and that every hamburger patty has 100 points that they look at for consistency and quality. Because that is what they're known for, is consistency and quality. So it doesn't matter if I'm Keystone or OSI or Sanchez Foods or Lopez Foods, I'm going to have the same hamburger patty anywhere in the world. How you get there doesn't matter.
Right, and certainly, the whole idea around outcome-based kind of perspective versus a transaction-based is one of the key elements of vested outsourcing. Just want to remind our members who might have joined late that you can ask questions in the lower left-hand corner of the chat. And notice we have another question. Kate, you can see these questions as well, correct? So I'm just going to read it out loud, and you can read along as well. The question is, you give excellent guidance on when to use vested outsourcing versus conventional outsourcing, keying on value versus expertise. Is there reason to pursue vested outsourcing even in cases of low value? For instance, high-risk strategic transactions like accounting, even though the value is low.
Yes, so it's the task itself may be inexpensive to acquire, or the widget may be inexpensive to acquire. But if there's risk or a strategic aspect, absolutely great, a great source of thinking about vested outsourcing. This is why you see Procter & Gamble facilities management, toilet cleaning, window washing. Strategic? Non-strategic, right? On the surface, you'd say, so not strategic. But in reality, it is highly strategic to them because their employees every day interact with the facilities. They want their employees to be very happy. They don't want their employees to be down, have downtime because the lights went off. They don't want their employees to have a bad experience in their cafeterias. So even though it's a low, one would say it's not a core, it's a low value activity, in reality it really is strategic because it creates value to the P&G ecosystem, right? So what we see is companies are applying it in areas that, one might say is, non-value, but reality, when you look at the impact on employee satisfaction, high value.
Right. Well, let me, we don't have any more questions right now, so certainly if you think of some questions, those of you that are on, please submit it. I'm going to go and ask my next question, which is, in the book, you kind of highlight the 10 elements of, traditional outsource relationships, such as, penny wise, a pound foolish, the activity trap. Which one of those, in your experience, is kind of the most common, or the one that's most difficult for companies to kind of overcome, and why?
That's an interesting question because there's different aspects. I like to think that buyers especially have cultures, and so they set up processes around being a buying organization. They have their whole procurement group, right? So a lot of times policies force someone to be penny wise and pound foolish, right? So I'm going to have a highly competitive environment. I've got my Excel spreadsheet, and I have my suppliers, on the columns, and I have my little activities, and I'm going to, force into picking the low price. Because that's the easy thing to do. That the policy does. The process is that as a buying organization we've generated. A perfect example of that is the state of Minnesota. So the state of Minnesota, you might remember, had a little trouble with the bridge that fell down a few years ago. Right. The Minneapolis Bridge, I-35 bridge, fell down. And it actually was a state law up until 1991, I believe, that the state of Minnesota had to buy the lowest price. Had to. It was a law. So another company that's adopted vested outsourcing is Dell. Now, Dell actually, you think I always pick on them. They're kind of the quintessential 800-pound gorilla, every dollar, every year. They decided to adopt vested outsourcing. They actually are going to be giving a presentation at the Reverse Logistics Association about their journey to vested and why they chose to go down vested. Because here's a company who had a policy every dollar, every year. Very, rigid way that they ran procurements. Were getting a lot of value as far as getting low price, but were they getting the end-to-end total perspective? And in their presentation, they say they step back and they look at the total cost and where they needed investments, and they could make investments, but their ecosystem also needed to make investments. Well, if I'm, why would I make investments in Dell if I'm not going to be around next year? Because you're going to bid me out.
Right.
It's a company policy, you're going to bid me out. All right, so if you want investments in the ecosystem and you want to have the benefits of, say, inventory across the ecosystem, not just within Dell's window, but don't we lower our total cost by managing inventory across the ecosystem? So in order to get the benefits across the ecosystem, we need to have these vested type relationships. So I'm real excited to see companies now that have read the book. Dell actually left, but I hope they say this in the conference in February when they give their talk. But they actually had a book meeting about it. So they passed the book around and invited their supplier and said, "How can we do this differently? Should we change the discussion? Should we change the dynamic? Is this something we should do? Is it something we should not do?" It took them about 18 months in order to go through and say, this is something that we believe is strategic. Very different from what they were doing in the past. So I think that the penny wise and pound foolish is the hardest one to get over because we've operated under that. The economy's given us permission to be penny wise and pound foolish, right? Because buyers had lots of power. Once they get that, the hard one to actually physically change is the activity trap. And the activity trap is when the buyer dictates how to do the work. And they do that because they feel like, well, I've done the work before. Obviously, I'm, creating value for my company. So I have to, I've got to be the expert. I have to tell you how to do it. Right? But think about that. They outsource to the experts. You shouldn't tell them how to do it. Right? If you were the expert, bring it in-house or clearly say, I want to buy staff augmentation. I'm going to micromanage you. I just need you to show up and be some butts and seats. But we don't realize that there's a difference between staff augmentation and true outsourcing, and we've made this bridge with, I kid you not, I've seen 800-page statement of work.
Well, I mean that's the way a lot of 3PLs feel, is they feel they feel that their clients are hiring them for just be a source of cheap labor, as opposed to giving them the freedom to be innovative or bring, a different way of doing things, to the table. We've got another.
We do need those, though, right? So there are some businesses that want to buy staff augmentation, but what we need to make, as buyers, need to make the decision: am I buying staff augmentation, or am I buying outsourcing? And we need to decide. Which camp we're in, and we need to use the right business model for the right camp.
Good point. We've got another question here that I think ties into another question that I have. So I'm gonna ask the question first from the member, and then I'll kind of add more color with my question. So the question is, what are some keys or elements that illustrate insight and governance versus oversight? Okay, and the question that triggered me here, the word in that question that kind of triggered my thought, which was the question that I have, is governance. So you and I, Kate, we were participated in a meeting last year with a 3PL and some of its customers, and that topic of governance came up, which was something that I hadn't really given much thought to. And we, as you might remember, we spent almost a whole afternoon talking about governance, and it was a very fascinating discussion. So with that member's question in mind, as well as mine, which is, what is governance, and why is it such an important piece of the puzzle? And I know that you also say, and I'm a perfect example of that, and the people in that room are a perfect example, it's an overlooked piece of the puzzle, the governance piece.
Yeah, so a lot of people think that SRM, or supplier relationship management, is governance. So let me define governance. Governance is managing the business with the supplier, right? So we have a business need, we're trying to achieve an outcome, and so in most businesses, think of it as an ecosystem. There's some processes that are on the buy side, the sell side, and you go back and forth, right? So if I look at the T-chart that Microsoft and Accenture have, if they look at the processes, it weaves in and out. So Accenture can do some work, and then it hands off to Microsoft, and then it's back to Accenture. So we're really looking at it from an end-to-end perspective. And so what we need to do is govern or manage the business with the supplier, because we've created this ecosystem that is highly efficient, or that's the goal. Versus you're just going to do this activity, right? I'm not, I can have you just do an activity, draw a box around it. In that case, I may want to have an SRM, a supplier, supplier relationship manager. I'm going to manage the supplier. And so in governance, in a vested relationship, governance is very important, and you have key elements or components that make up a vested governance. There's actually four aspects, and they're spelled out in the second book, the Vested Outsourcing Manual. So there's a whole chapter on governance and rule number 5, insight versus oversight governance. So the first component is the relationship management. How are we going to work together? So there's some tricks. For example, Procter & Gamble uses what they call a bow tie, right? A two in the box, or a reverse bow tie. So we have peer-to-peer folks, right? So if, on facilities management, if you're in charge of the dining and cafeteria management, I'm in charge of cafeteria management. So we have a peer-to-peer relationship for the scope of work. And in some cases, that may be very small scope, right? But we have functional kind of expertise that say, as we execute this process, who's on point for me? So instead of just having an account manager, we want to actually have that work responsibility management. So if the service provider has a question about cafeterias, they have a counterpoint at P&G to go to, right? If Microsoft, if Accenture has a question about accounts payable, they have a counterpoint to go to. So in Microsoft's back office procure to pay, there's 3 key process areas that they look at that would be 2 in a box. In P&G, the scope is huge. It's this all worldwide facilities and real estate management. So they've got about 40 in the box folks. Doesn't mean that they have to be full-time, but those are the experts in that area. And when you have a problem, they engage at the problem level. So having a 2 in a box philosophy, having a tiered approach. So I want the workers to solve the problem at the lowest possible level. I got a problem. They actually have 14 days to solve problems. So if there's a problem between them, so let's say the service provider raises an issue and there's a problem, and they say, hey, buyer, I need your help in solving this problem. The buyer has 14 days to solve it. If they can, it escalates up, right? And then so there's a formal process for managing problems and ideas. Especially ideas. The buyers, I cannot tell you how many times a supplier has said, I've got a great idea. And the buyer goes, well, we don't do it like that. Never done it like that. Oh, I don't know. That'll take marketing. We'll have to change a process. I don't know if we could, too politically, tough to get that one through. So one of the things that you see is this formal way to manage ideas. Because what we've seen is an idea gets high enough, almost all ideas are good ideas. Right. We're just not liberating the ideas, and we're not putting the effort around the business case, right? Another thing that we see in relationship management is a clear delineation of roles. So who is managing the contract and the relationship, who is managing the business, and who's managing what we call transformation. We often see that a traditional way is the person who's running the service delivery right, is also chartered with implementing new ideas. Well, we want to actually put the new idea part on steroids. So you see a clear delineation that most deals have at least one person that is totally responsible for implementing the new ideas. Problem comes up, new idea comes up, let's do a business case, let's push it through, let's have a process around that. So we're embracing the innovation and the ideas. So there's lots of approaches and tactics that you actually embed into the day-to-day management. So governance is that day-to-day management of the business with the supplier. It's not, and you actually put it in your contract. So now the buyer and the supplier are contractually obligated to manage the business in a smart way.
Yeah, not
and you can change it, right? So, but you're contractually obligated to manage new ideas.
Right.
There's a process for it.
Right. I think in that meeting that I referenced earlier, I think I think part of what triggered that conversation, which I thought was interesting, was that mostly all the customers in that meeting didn't really have a good understanding of the 3PL's org chart in terms of the resources that 3PL was providing to the customer, right? So the customer only really knew their account manager, but as the 3PL was making clear in that room, it's like, oh, we've got all these other resources available to you that are acting on behalf of, working on behalf of your business. And that was the first time that a lot of those customers actually realized that there was a whole team behind that account manager, and that those people were sources of knowledge and expertise and perhaps go-to people if they had questions or, to your point, ideas or things of that nature. And I think that was kind of an interesting takeaway for me from that meeting, was just the lack of visibility in terms of who's actually working on this account for you, and having some mutual relationships and lines of communication and communication between the parties on both sides.
Yeah, so what we want to do is strive to have a highly efficient way that we work together with some processes and formal mechanisms so that we manage the business the most effective we can, and especially embrace the idea that business happens. If you try to have a contract today, it's going to be out of whack in a month and a year, right? Because business happens. So how do we embrace those changes and have a flexible, dynamic framework? And governance are the mechanisms and the process that we do that to keep us mutually aligned.
Well, to jump off that last point that you just mentioned, one of the white papers that you wrote, you highlight you highlight 10 key lessons that companies should apply when developing strategic business relationships, and the paper is based on some key lessons from the work of Dr. Oliver Williamson, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for his work on transaction cost economics. And my favorite lesson out of the 10 is use a contract as a framework, not a legal weapon. So what do you mean, by that? And can you give us an example of, what is a quote unquote a contract as a framework? And then if you could also touch upon, going through the legal weapon side of things. One of the other things I often hear from companies is, I see our legal department as being a potential bottleneck to all this, because everything has to go through legal, and legal's job is to basically add 25 pages of, protect our butts type of thing into any kind of contract. So talk about the contracting piece a little bit. What do you mean by contract as a flexible framework, and what's the role of legal? How do you get the legal department to kind of embrace that lesson?
It's interesting because a lot of people think that legal is going to hate what we teach, and then you actually expose them to it, and they like it. And the legal folks say, "You mean you're getting the business people to actually understand the business and contract for the business? Really?" So they get excited about it, actually. So Baker McKenzie has an outsourcing practice. Ed Hansen, amazing attorney specializing in outsourcing, loves vested outsourcing because it really brings the business and the legal community together, because a lot of the lawyers will say that the business people don't know anything about contracting and they don't document their business, so they have to protect the company, and the way they do this was a lot of T's and C's. I don't trust you to understand your business and how you're going to manage the business and the dynamic aspects of the business. So I'm going to put in limitations, liabilities, terminations for convenience. And they do that. Think about it. Their job is to protect the company. And the more they feel like the business understands the business and you have a good relationship with your supplier who's going to help you protect the business as well, the more they get comfortable. So it's a perception gap that once they understand, it's not that big a deal. But if you think about the International Association for Contract and Commercial Management, they are a key nonprofit in the world for attorneys and contracting community. They actually help co-write the second book. They're promoting these concepts of having a flexible framework. So when I use the term flexible framework, which is really Oliver Williamson's term, what we want to do is have a master services agreement that's very small, right? It's going to have the whereas we intend to do work together, start, end date, but it's going to be very tiny. And then the contract itself would have lots of exhibits, right? So I have a shared vision, a statement of intent. By the way, we talk about statements of intent. We actually have the parties write their behaviors into the contract. What's an acceptable behavior and what's not an acceptable behavior? Okay, that because you behave poorly, you need to fix that, right? It's because that's where a lot of times we have a problem come up and we're not behaving ethically, we're not behaving with flexibility, right? So we actually put our behaviors in because it kind of ties the ethics back to the contract.
Right.
So vested outsourcing isn't for companies who are unethical. I just did a workshop actually with Jones Lang LaSalle, and they are actually number one in the world as far as ethics. There's some kind of a, people vote on like Forbes or whoever who's the most ethical. So Jones Lang LaSalle is number one in terms of it being an ethical company. P&G is as well. So they don't have to write their ethics in because they already are highly ethical. But so we have statement of intent. We have our statement of work. It's an attachment because business happens. We actually want to change, right? So, hey, I've got new scope. Okay, well, no big deal. We'll add it. I've got a new process that we want to think about in governance. Okay, great. We should be managing the businesses, so let's add it. So you embrace change. You embrace the dynamic aspects of business, and the contract then becomes a rolling document to make sure that you're continually aligned.
Well, that's a great point. Sorry to interrupt, but that's a great point because it just reminded me, obviously in analyst speak, we all talk about how, today's business environment is so dynamic, particularly in the supply chain world. And I just clearly remember back in 2008, one particular deal, long-term deal in the automotive industry that was kind of, signed early on in the year. Of course, the economy was doing well in the beginning of the year, everything else. And then, second half of 2008, the market crashed, and all of a sudden, the outlook for the automotive industry was completely different than it was at the beginning of 2008. So all the, anticipated volumes for the business was going to be different moving on at that point in time, late 2008, beginning 2009, than it was when the contract was signed. And then how do you handle, so to your point in terms of a contracting, as a flexible framework, I think that lends itself better to situations where, you've got commodity prices that are constantly changing, fuel prices are constantly changing, and, things like this, like what happened in 2008, that can completely turn, a long-term forecast upside down, right?
Yeah, and that's why one of the rules, rule number 4, is a pricing model with incentives, right, instead of prices. You go to Starbucks and you have a price for a cup of coffee, right? You should have a pricing model for your strategic suppliers because you don't want to be testing the market. What we want to do is actually get to the raw cost structures because the raw cost structures are the raw cost structures. If electricity goes up, electricity goes up. If labor wages go up, labor wages go up. So don't deny the fact that, we have to pay the electricity bill and the labor, right? Suck it up, pay the cost, and break down and have a model. And what if volumes came in half? The service provider still has fixed costs. You just going to hose them with them because your market forecast just got blown? Business happens. So what we do is we have a pricing model, and as business changes, the inputs and the variables in that, you can start to see how people make money. So you have an agreement that here's how the service provider makes money. And a rising, I like to think a rising tide floats all boats and sinks all boats, right? So if the general environment is better, the buyer and the service provider are going to grow together. If we tank, we're both going to go down together, right? So there's shared risk and shared reward, and it takes a model will actually take the bickering out of the relationship. So Microsoft, for example, had a 7-year contract. They've actually extended it 5 years. They have a pricing model. They never debate prices. 5 years into this deal, they never debate prices because they have a model, and the model says, hey, we've agreed on the principles of how you make money. And as long as the principles are sound, volumes go through, COLA, suck it up, COLA, we got to have cost of living, right? Right. So you quit bickering, and now you can actually focus on the proactive stuff because you've got an agreement on the principle of how the companies make money and how they create value.
Great. I noticed that we're running short on time here. I noticed we got 2 more questions from our members. I'm going to get to those questions now. So the first one is, can you offer any insights on how to evolve existing/legacy outsourcing relationships into vested outsourcing, where the current investment of legacy commitments makes changing suppliers unfeasible?
Yes. So a great example would be what Dell did, right? So they had an existing supplier, and they had always bid it out, but there was a significant amount of investment. And the cost, right? So how do the suppliers fight back when they made investments? There's usually a ramp up or a transition fee. So I'm the new supplier, and I think you're going to hose me. So I'm going to charge you a transition fee or some kind of investment. So what you start to see is a discussion, having a candid discussion like Dell did. Give them a book, sit down and say, you know what? It's obviously tough for us to switch. Is there a way that we can have a more proactive, positive, value creation relationship? And have a discussion with them. And that's the best way that I've seen to do that, is to make it a discussion. Come to the university's 3-day open enrollment class. Capital One did that with their call center supplier, is they came together and said, is this something that's a good fit for us? What do you think? Yeah, they called it the skinny dipping meeting. Are you in? You out? You in? You out? Is it good for us? Is it not good for us, right? Right. That's a great way to do it. Think of it as a discussion. Hey, this is a different way. Is it something you would be interested in? Does that help? Does that answer that?
Great. Well, one of the things that we'll talk about later is that the discussion is not going to end after we finish the MindPick session today. We're going to continue the conversation online on the Adelante website, because we do have a discussion forum on the website where members can continue to post questions. You have access to that, Kate, so you can see the questions that people will post there ongoing and continue with them. The member just said, excellent answer, very helpful, thank you. So there, you got some immediate response there. Let's ask the other question, and then we'll wrap it up. The next question is related to rule number 2, focus on the what, not the how. Have you found examples where vested outsourcing relationships have stumbled on the how, because the supplier was not humbled enough to ask for help on the how?
Yeah. So, and actually, if you think about the end-to-end, a supplier, will look at their 4 walls, but the big fixes are almost cross-company, right? So you want to create a process that exposes weaknesses in the how, and that's a good thing, right? It's a really good thing. So by looking at it end-to-end. So if you think about the Air Force, the GE and the Navy did this with the 404 engine down in Jacksonville, Florida at the depot. So under this vested relationship, GE had to manage the depot, but the government employees had to actually be the touch labor. And so they mapped out and said, here's the process, and we have a weakness here. How do we actually have a formal way to raise our hands so that we all work together when we have process issues? And that's why you start to be very effective, because it highlights end-to-end process effectiveness, right? Because you may have one party doing something to compensate for another party. And you want to actually look and expose this. I call them the whack-a-mole, right? You ever go to the fair and you whack the mole, but it pops up somewhere else?
Right.
Well, we want to eliminate the moles. And so a good process around roles and responsibilities and a good governance that has root cause analysis on an end-to-end perspective will actually whack those moles. And so it encourages that supplier, it's okay. It's okay to have red, because red means we have an opportunity to fix something. That's actually cool, right? Wow, we can fix something.
Great. Well, we're at the 45-minute mark, so I'm going to ask the last question, which is really more, okay, so we've listened to, the Best at Outsourcing. We read the book. We drank the Kool-Aid, right? We really believe in it. We really believe that it will help take our relationships, business relationships, to the next level of value and performance, et cetera. How do you get started? I mean, so, when the members now kind of shut down and, get back to work this afternoon and in the days ahead, what recommendations do you have for them to kind of take those, crawl, walk, run type of steps towards this? What should be some of those first steps they should take to, if they're interested in really taking what they've read, what they've learned, and taking these principles and putting them into practice?
There's really, we almost think of it as an evolution. So there's 4 steps. There's awareness, understanding, implementation, and then mastery. So there's tools in the toolkit for different types, where you are in your journey. So think of it as a journey, awareness. So if you're in the awareness zone, this session today is awareness, right? You can, if you really want to get into understanding, you can take our 3-day class. There's the online, the 4 modules of online. They're free, they're complimentary, they're for everyone. Invite your supplier, your buyer to get an understanding. Go to the class with them together. Give them the book. Really start to have meetings and discuss that. Now you get a decision that says, yes, I want to move forward, right? So to use Dell, as an example, they had a book club meeting, talked about it, had sent a couple people to the class, and they said, all right, we're going to move forward. And then they chose to use our online getting to a vested agreement. So the Vested Outsourcing Manual, and there's a complimentary online class that's designed for buyers and suppliers to take the class together online. So that way, if they're remote and someone might be in China, wherever the supplier and the buyers are not always in the same spot, they do a module and then they do the homework, right? I'll use the word homework, but it's a component of their contract. And there's 19 modules, and by the time they get to the end, they've actually written their contract or rewritten their contract. Because they could start with their existing contract and go, wow, here's where I don't have good governance. We need to put governance in. What's in governance? So they can take their existing contract, take out the bad stuff, put in the good stuff, and have a new deal, right? So that's one way that they've done it. We also do facilitated workshops. Capital One is a great example where we're, facilitated workshops with them. So the buyer and the supplier together, and we come in and we coach them on their work. So, but the very first step is, awareness, and then understanding and making the choice. Do you choose to move forward? You got to make the choice, and it takes 2 to tango.
Great points. And I love that image of a book club, with your suppliers. My daughter and my wife are in a mother-daughter book club, and that's what kind of the vision that pops into my head to see supply chain executives both on the buy side and the sell side sitting together discussing the Vested Outsourcing book and talking about it. So, Kate, as always, thank you very much. I'm sure this was of great value and interest to our members. Certainly appreciate you taking the time. And just a reminder to our members again, let's keep the conversation going online. We have the discussion forum, and there were questions you had that you want to ask Kate and just didn't get around to it today, or as you continue to think about some of the points that were brought up in the discussion. If new questions come, please post them on the discussion forum. Certainly, Kate will have access to that, and you can see each other's questions and answer each other's questions as well. So look forward to having that discussion online. So again, thank you to all our members for joining us, and Kate, thank you once again.
Thank you.